Welcome to Transnational Competition Law course, and dear learner and viewers, we have been discussing the extraterritorial application and the transnational application of competition law in BRICS countries. We have taken an overview of the BRICS country and we have particularly discussed the transnational application of the competition law in Brazil. Today we are going to discuss about the competition law in Russia. Dear learner and viewer, the competition law in Russia also constitute one of the very important segment in our understanding of transnational competition law because the Russia consolidated its power over an undefined territory and it has drawn under the incipient state which was based on imperial absolutism. The Soviet Empire was a kind of a paradox in Russian trajectory and it has created an irrational economic system and that ended up causing the state's structural crisis and thunderous downfall. We can refer here to Perestroika and Glasnost, the two important milestones in churning the entire Russian economy and the Russian state bringing to a new kind of the regime. In this context, the first Russian competition authority was created, known as the State Committee for Anti-Monopoly Policy and Support for New Structure, and a law was passed which was nomenclatured as on competition and the restriction of monopolistic activity on goods market in 1991 in the backdrop of Glasnost and the Perestroika policies of erstwhile Soviet Union. The law of 1999, which nomenclatured as on competition and restriction of monopolistic activity on goods market, was contained relatively a mild sanction for most of the violation, preferring seize and designed order and disgorgement of improperly received income to direct fines or the punishment of the individual. So, the focus of the law deserves our attention that it tries to see most of the antitrust and anti-competition violence from the perspective of preferring a kind of a seize and preferring a kind of a desisted orders, and then that led to the disgorgement of all kind of improperly received income to direct fines and the punishment of the individual. The new Russian federal law on competition, therefore, on the protection of the competition 1991, try to touch major areas of focus of the Russian competition law, and those areas of focus of the law on the protection of competition 1991 happens to be number one is the prohibition of monopolistic behavior. Number two, the prohibition on the unfair competition. Number three, the prohibition of anti-competitive action. And number four, that a kind of a vigilance by the state authorities and agency to see that there is no any kind of the anti-competitive behavior. In that respect, we find that the purpose of the 1991 law on the protection of competition, 2006, which was and as well as the new as well as the law relating to on competition and restrictions of monopoly activity on the goods market taken together seems to target to overhaul the entire competition law enforcement regime and to streamline the existing competition law framework to introduce certain new concepts, new approaches, and new redesigning of the entire competition law and structure in Russia. Therefore, as we have seen the law on the competition, which is known as on competition and the restriction of the monopolistic activity of goods market 1991, then we find that the, that predecessing law, which has been replaced by a new law on the protection of the competition in 2006, we find that this law applies to all kind of the financial organization, and then it is being managed and administered by the Code of Administrative Offences, which provides some kind of a punitive action, fines for the violation of antitrust measures and any kind of a competition concerns. Thus, we see that the law which was put into force in 1999 on the protection of uh, the law which was put in practice in 1991, known as on competition and restrictions of monopolies activities on the goods market in 1991, was replaced by a law on the protection of competition in 2006. And then finally in 2009, we see that we have another slew of the legislative reform, which is called the second anti-monopoly package, which has focused primarily on the anti-cartel enforcement. And the most recent amendment to the second anti-monopoly package happens to be the third anti-monopoly package, which was promulgated in 2012. Thus, we see that after the glasnost and perestroika, and after the Russian economy has undergone to a complete metamorphosis and change, we find there has been regular legislative upgrades and amendment in the regime of competition law, be that the law on competition and the restrictions of monopolies activities and goods market 1991, be that the law on the protection of competition 2006, or be that the law what is called as the second anti-monopoly package of 2009 and the third anti-monopoly package of 2012. We see all the requisite legislative upgrades, all the modification, all the necessary amendments have been introduced in the law on the protection of competition and the Criminal Code of Russian Federation and the Code of Russian Federation on administrative violation of the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service. Thus, these three laws and their new incarnation and the new packaging, the new designing happens to govern the competition laws and policy and enforcement in Russia. For the sake of reiteration, we have to see that how the law on protection of competition have been aided by the analogous and the auxiliary laws, which happens to be on one side the criminal code of the Russian Federation, on the other side we happens to be the code of Russian Federation on administrative violations and federal anti-monopoly services. Thus, we see that there is a kind of a resurgence to see all competition concern under the law on the protection of the competition with the criminal law and as well as the administrative violation law in relation to monopoly. Taken together, we see that the Russian's anti-monopoly regulation still seems to be a case of constant improvement and constant refinement, and still it's undergoing some kind of a gradual changes. It happens to be evolving with many uncertainties and compliance changes, and it's a kind of a gradual and the perpetual exercises which is undergoing, and the Russian economy and the Russia as a country is experimenting these competition law in a very careful manner, and most of the key provisions of the competition law in Russia happens to be very clear in matters of because we have seen that it tries to focus on the prohibition of monopolistic behavior. It tries to curb the unfair competition. It tries to prevent anti-competitive behavior. It tries to put all kinds of actions of the cartel, and it tries to see that the state authorities and agencies on competition should always remain very circumspect, and that way it tries to interpret the law which was passed in on competition and the restrictions of monopolistic activities of goods market in 1991, and then on the protection of the competition 2006. Vis-a-vis, we have seen that in 2009 the second anti-monopoly package was brought into. In 2012 the third anti-monopoly package was brought into, and thus the entire law stands as of now, be that the law on the protection of competition, be that the law on the criminal code of the Russian Federation, be that the law on code of Russian Federation on administrative violation of federal anti-monopoly services, taken together, try to see that in Russia anti-monopoly regulation goes very well and happens to see some of the very pragmatic interpretation of the law. With this, dear learner and viewer, with this introduction of the legislative framework on the competition law or anti-monopoly law, it is called, as it is called antitrust law in US, in United States. In Russia, it is neither called competition law nor it is called the antitrust law, but it is generally nomenclated as the anti-monopoly law. And the very anatomy of the anti-monopoly law in Russia happens to be a case of great interest to be read and to be interpreted. With this, dear learner, we will try to see as to what happens to be the nature, a scope of the restriction of the monopoly, and how it tries to address all the issues of competition concerned by the sleeve of the reforms of the law. We see that competition and restriction of monopoly activity on commodity market passed in 1991 for the first time, and then we see that law has undergone to a change in 1995, and with additions and amendment brought into 1992, 1995, and 1998 and 2000. So that law of 1991, which happens to deal with the competition and restrictions of monopoly activity on the commodities market, have undergone to a complete change and complete facelifting, and that facelifting was not brought only in 1992, it was in 1995, it was in 1998, and it was in 2000. So more than 4 occasions this law was allowed to be amended, and with this law we have the another law on federal law number 83 FZ of 1995, which have introduced the requirement related to disclosure of the official constituting commercial secrets, administrative liability for the official of the federal anti-monopoly body, and it also cast an obligation to execute the orders of the federal anti-monopoly body. Therefore, what we see that this law has its own skeleton, happens to be very potential in curbing the competition, in bringing the restriction of the monopoly activity on the commodity market of 1991, and it has been put to gradual sense of reform and regular legislative upgrades in 1992, in 1995, in 1998, in 2000. Nonetheless, this law was very well supplemented by the another law on the issue of the competition concern. That law happens to be the federal law number 83 FZ of May 1995, and this law has introduced certain requirement of the disclosure and the disclosure was something meant to be a mandatory conditions of the information constituting all kinds of the commercial secrets, all kinds of the trade secret, all kinds of the administrative liability which can be imposed on all officials of the federal anti-monopoly body in respect to looking at, to be circumspect, to be careful on all competition concern, all anti-monopoly activities, and it also happens to see and cast a kind of a duty, a kind of an obligation to execute all kinds of order which are related to the anti-monopoly violation, and the federal anti-monopoly body thus happens to be one of the leading agency in matters of looking at and addressing the issues of competition and the anti-monopoly. Additionally, what we see that the potentiality of this law, that though it amend on the restriction of monopoly activity on commodity market vis-a-vis the competition, then what we find that the restrictions of monopoly activities on the commodity market happens to ensure compliance with all anti-monopoly regulation by the mechanism of the command and control, by the mechanism of sanctioning regime, by the mechanism of the imposition of the fine. Thus, we see that the major functions of the federal anti-monopoly authority consist of a broad range of the activities and function within its purview of the power, and that deserves to be studied, that the function of the anti-monopoly law is not merely to see that it is going to see that how disclosure of information constituting commercial secret and as well as the federal anti-monopoly body are to be examined. It's not only the case that they are set with the obligation and the goals to execute orders of the federal anti-monopoly body, but it has to be very proactive in matters of submitting proposal for improving anti-monopoly legislation, its application, its interpretation, and its execution. And then, while submitting the proposal for improving the anti-monopoly legislation, what we find that the Russian anti-monopoly law tried to see that the improvement of the legislation can only be done if we have some new sets of interpretation, some new mechanism of application, some new sets or new standards of redesigning any kind of the proposals. Then what the anti-monopoly authority in the federal system of Russia used to function is the fact that it primarily recommends all kinds of action to support commodity market and as well as the competition, so that in the commodity market or in the competitiveness of the market, there happens to be no case of any kind of a monopolization. There should not be any kind of a case of oligopoly. There is no case of concentration of the wealth. There is no case of any kind of a merger which has a tendency of combination and any kind of an anti-competitive behavior and conduct which happens to be detrimental on the economy of the Russia and the market of the Russia, and that kind of a recommendation seems within the legitimate boundaries of the federal anti-monopoly body dealing on the competition concerns. This body is also given charge of what you call the development as well as the implementation measures to demonopolize production as well as the distribution. So the very terminology which has been used in the earlier and classical laws than that of the competition law, we see the precursor of the competition law happens to be the monopoly law, and that's why the Russian Federation have continued the terminology of the monopoly and the monopolization and it tries to see that the entire competition law hitting very hard to the monopolistic system, the oligopolistic system, and any kind of a concentration in the market. And therefore, the Russian Federation is a case which always the Federal Anti-Monopoly Authority in Russia happens to be meticulously engaged not only in the development but its forceful implementation of all kinds of measures which it deems necessary, which it deems expedient to the entire process of the demonopolization of not only the production but the distribution of the goods and services in Russian market. Besides the function of submitting proposal for improvement of the anti-monopoly legislation and its application, besides recommendation of to support commodity market and competition, and besides having new sets of the development and the implementation measure for the demonopolization of production and distribution, that the Russian Federal Anti-Monopoly Authority also happens to keep a regular kind of a vigil, regular kind of a monitoring, regular kind of the compliance record with all kinds of anti-monopoly regulations, be that the regulation of 1991, be that its amendment in 1992 or in 1995 or 2000, or the new law which came into being in 2000, 2001, 2006, known as the Russian Law on the Competition on the Protection of Competition, or for that matter, in 2009 law on the second anti-monopoly, or 2012 law on the third anti-monopoly package, along with the supporting laws on the protection of competition, as well as the Criminal Code of Russian Federation and the Code of Russian Federation on administrative violation of the Federal Anti-Monopoly Services. Taken together, the Federal Law number 83 FZ of 1995, the sleeve of law, the plethora of law, the corpus of law, which the Russian Federation has handed over on the anti-monopoly, the primary duty and the function of the Federal Anti-Monopoly Authority is to see that these laws are to be monitored in a very term. It has to be observed in the more compliance. There should be less cases of the deviances, and the entire anti-monopoly regulation, which we have just now called out in a short while, happens to be the case of an economic entity and the setup, and there should be a reorganization, and there should be liquidation of any kind of the firm and entity indulging into the anti-monopoly activities and the violation of anti-monopoly regulation. Thus, we can say that the entire functions and the powers and functions of the Russian Federal Anti-Monopoly Authority happens to see that the entire competition and the anti-monopoly law in Russia must have control over all kinds of transactions, all kinds of agreement, all kinds of acquisition, and try to see that it directly hits hard to the monopoly activities. And then the federal monopoly anti-monopoly body seems to be responsible, not only responsible but charged for enforcing the anti-monopolies laws and proposing a gradual refinement and improvement for the anti-monopoly legislation. The violation on the count of anti-monopoly legislations of all kinds of the law which has been passed from 1991 down to this day seems to result into a kind of an administrative and as well as the criminal liability for the organization and as well as the individual. It is something very notable here to discuss that the administrative and the criminal liability is not only a case of a corporate liability, but it can also see and visualize the individual's liability, and then it tries to to have a very salutary kind of an impact and a ripple effect on any kind of anti-monopoly violation in Russian Federation. Thus, as a whole, dear learner, what we see that the Russia's federal anti-monopoly federal authority happens to see a kind of a responsibility, and it tries to ensures that all the monopoly legislations are to be complied with, and the obligations and the responsibility as per the record, it happens to be very very appealing and appreciating that the federal anti-monopoly body have been discharging its duty in the right earnest to govern all kind of anti-monopoly concerns and the competition concerns in Russia. With this, dear learner and viewer, I hope the understanding of the Russian competition law will be again a kind of an addition to the understanding of transnational application of the competition law in the BRICS country in particular and other jurisdictions of the world in general. With this, I, 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 I conclude and I thank and I wish you a happy learning.